It was a calm summer evening when Officer Sarah Davis received the call. A murder had been reported at an upscale apartment in the heart of the city. The victim was identified as Jake Turner, a 32-year-old businessman with a well-known reputation in the community. His death was shocking. He had been found lifeless in his bed, stabbed multiple times. But what truly made the case peculiar was the scene that followed. When Sarah arrived at the apartment, the victim's ex-girlfriend, Vanessa Carter, stood by the door, her face pale and eyes wide with shock. She was Jake's baby mama, someone he had known for over a decade. They had a complicated history, filled with love, betrayal, and bitter arguments. But it wasn't the kind of relationship that screamed murder. Yet here they were. "How did this happen?" Sarah asked, trying to mask her suspicion as she approached Vanessa, who was visibly distressed. Vanessa wrung her hands nervously. "I don't know. I came over this morning to wish him happy birthday and I found him like this." Her voice trembled and her body shook with what seemed like genuine grief. "I didn't know who else to call. Are you sure there's no one else involved? Did you see anyone leave the apartment?" Sarah pressed, observing Vanessa's reaction closely. Vanessa shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, no one. I I was supposed to spend the day with him. He asked me to come over. We were supposed to talk about things, about our daughter, and then—" She choked up, unable to finish her sentence. Sarah took note of Vanessa's story, but something didn't add up. The two of them had been in an open relationship for the last few months after Jake had rekindled things with her. They had a child together, a little girl named Mia, who was only 3 years old. While Jake had been dating other people, Vanessa had been trying to rebuild her relationship with him, and it appeared that she had finally gained his trust again. Jake had been vulnerable in the months leading up to his death, telling his friends that he had been considering giving things another try with Vanessa. It was on his birthday, a day he was looking forward to, that his life had been taken. But why? What could have prompted Vanessa to kill him after they had reconnected? As Sarah carefully examined the crime scene, she noted that the apartment was neat, almost too neat. There were no signs of a struggle. It was almost as if Jake had trusted his killer, allowed them to get close enough to deliver a deadly blow. The stab wounds were precise, indicating a level of familiarity and calmness. This wasn't a crime of passion. It felt calculated. The birthday cake, half-eaten, still sat on the table near the window, with candles left unlit. There was no sign of forced entry. It was a bizarre scene, and the more Sarah thought about it, the more she felt that Vanessa was hiding something. Sarah turned to Vanessa, trying to make sense of the situation. "Vanessa, do you mind if I ask you a few more questions?" Vanessa wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. "I've told you everything, officer. I just don't understand why this happened." "I know this is hard," Sarah said gently, "but I need you to think back. Was there anyone who would have had a reason to hurt Jake? Any past arguments, jealousy, or threats?" Vanessa hesitated, then shook her head again. "No, I don't know, but there was something about his birthday this year. He was acting different. He seemed worried, like he was afraid of something." The words hung in the air. Afraid of something. Sarah filed that away in her mind. She would need to dig deeper into Jake's recent behavior, his relationships, and his interactions leading up to that fateful day. But for now, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Vanessa was involved in some way. She had been there when Jake died, and she had access to him. As Sarah looked at the grief-stricken woman in front of her, she couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa knew more than she was letting on. There were too many questions, and Sarah was determined to find the answers. Detective Sarah Davis didn't sleep much that night. The case gnawed at her mind as she replayed the scene at Jake Turner's apartment over and over again. Vanessa's face, the tears, her trembling hands, they all seemed too rehearsed. Sarah had seen her share of grief-stricken suspects, but something about Vanessa felt off. Maybe it was the way she so quickly distanced herself from the crime. Or maybe it was the calmness in her demeanor, despite the violence that had unfolded in her presence. The next morning, Sarah decided to take a closer look at Jake's life. She needed to understand his relationships better. What could have triggered someone close to him to commit such a brutal act? And why on his birthday? Sarah started by reviewing Jake's history, his career, his personal life, his friendships. He had made a name for himself in the tech industry, working long hours to build a small but successful software company. His reputation was solid. Everyone in the office described him as a driven and responsible leader. But when it came to his love life, that was where things got complicated. Jake had been involved in an open relationship with Vanessa for years, ever since their daughter Mia had been born. It wasn't exactly a traditional setup, but it worked for them, at least for a while. The arrangement allowed Jake to date other women while Vanessa remained a constant presence in his life, caring for their daughter. But over time, Vanessa had become more jealous of Jake's other relationships, especially after he began seeing a woman named Amber. Amber, Sarah discovered, was a key part of Jake's life in the months leading up to his murder. She had been living with Jake on and off, staying in the apartment, and their relationship seemed to be growing more serious. Amber was in her late 20s, blonde, and worked as a marketing consultant. According to mutual friends, Jake had even mentioned that he was considering making things official with Amber, something he hadn't done with Vanessa. Sarah's curiosity piqued. There was a lot of tension in the air when it came to these women. Vanessa, Amber, were they both capable of murder, or was there more to the story? She decided to pay Amber a visit. If anyone could shed light on Jake's feelings and his relationship with Vanessa, it would be Amber. She hoped to get a clearer picture of the emotional landscape that had led to Jake's tragic end. Amber lived in a small apartment near downtown. When Sarah arrived, Amber seemed surprised but not exactly hostile. She invited Sarah in, offering her a glass of water. "I didn't know Jake had been killed," Amber said, shaking her head in disbelief. This is horrible." Sarah sat down, watching Amber closely. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm investigating Jake's death, and I need to ask you a few questions. Can you tell me about your relationship with him? How serious was it?" Amber looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting a ring. "We were getting pretty serious. Jake had been spending a lot of time with me, and we talked about future plans. He said he wanted to be with me exclusively, but..." "But what?" Sarah pressed. Amber hesitated before answering, her eyes drifting toward the window. "But he was still seeing Vanessa, even though he told me he wanted to end things with her. I didn't like it, but I didn't know how to handle it. I was just waiting for him to make the decision." This was the first clue that Sarah had been hoping for. Jake had been planning to break things off with Vanessa for good, to choose Amber over her. That could explain a lot. The motive for someone desperate to keep Jake in their life, especially if they were afraid of losing him for good. Sarah leaned in. "Did Vanessa know about you two?" Amber's expression faltered. "Of course she did. She was, she was always around, always hovering. I could never get a moment alone with Jake. It was frustrating, but I loved him, and I thought eventually she'd accept that we were more than just an arrangement. I didn't think she would, I didn't think she'd react like this." "React like what?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. She started showing up at Jake's apartment unannounced, always trying to make things seem like they were still a family. She'd even come over when I was there, and it made me uncomfortable. I thought she was trying to manipulate him. She would always remind him of their daughter Mia, and how they needed to stay close for her sake." Sarah took note of Amber's words. It was clear that Vanessa wasn't happy with the idea of Jake moving on, but was it jealousy or something darker? Had she been pushed to the point where she couldn't stand the thought of losing Jake to another woman, even if they had been in an open relationship? "Did Jake ever mention any threats from Vanessa?" Sarah asked. "Did she ever express anger or hostility toward you?" Amber's face grew serious. Detective Sarah Davis was beginning to piece together the fragments of Jake Turner's life, his relationships, his ambitions, his fears. As she sat in her office reviewing the statements and evidence so far, one thing became painfully clear. There was more to this murder than just jealousy or a love triangle. Something darker, something more calculated, was lurking behind Jake's death. And the woman at the center of it all, Vanessa Carter, was not as innocent as she appeared. Sarah's first step the next morning was to dig deeper into Vanessa's background. She needed to know what had driven this woman to take such drastic action. Was it truly just a broken heart, or was there something more sinister at play? She started by visiting the records office. She pulled up Vanessa Carter's criminal history, hoping to find any past run-ins with the law. It was a long shot, but sometimes a person's history could reveal a pattern. To Sarah's surprise, Vanessa had no criminal record, at least not one that was immediately obvious. She had no history of violent behavior or even petty crimes. But Sarah had learned not to trust appearances. People could hide their pasts, especially if they had something to protect. The next logical step was to look into Vanessa's financial records. If she had been in financial trouble, it could have been a motive. Jake had been wealthy, with a successful career, and Vanessa had always seemed dependent on him, despite their strained relationship. Sarah was able to access bank statements and credit card records under a search warrant, and what she found made her stomach churn. Vanessa had been using Jake's money in ways that seemed far more reckless than someone merely trying to make ends meet. A series of large transactions, all with a similar pattern: payments to untraceable accounts, purchases of expensive items like jewelry and designer clothes, suggested that Vanessa had been living beyond her means. Jake had been funding more than just their daughter's needs. It seemed like she had been preparing for something big. But what? Sarah took the records to her partner, Officer Mark Collins, and asked him to look through them while she continued her investigation. Mark was good with numbers, and he'd often catch things she overlooked. After a few hours, he called her into his office. "I think I've found something," Mark said, pointing at a specific transaction on the screen. "This one, it's a transfer to a private investigator. It's a few $1,000s about 6 weeks ago." "A private investigator?" Sarah echoed. What was Vanessa hiring him for? They dug deeper, trying to uncover the purpose of the transaction. Mark found the name of the investigator, a man named Thomas Hall. His records showed that he had been hired by Vanessa to gather information on Jake, his personal life, his finances, and even his movements. Vanessa was spying on Jake, Sarah muttered to herself. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. Vanessa hadn't just been jealous, she had been plotting. She had known about Jake's relationship with Amber and had been desperate to find a way to get him back. Sarah immediately made a call to the private investigator's office. It didn't take long for Thomas Hall to answer. After a brief conversation, he agreed to meet with Sarah the following day. The meeting was set for late afternoon in a quiet cafe. When Sarah arrived, she saw a middle-aged man sitting at a corner table. He was well-dressed with sharp features and a calm demeanor, someone who clearly understood the art of discretion. As Sarah sat down across from him, she wasted no time. "I understand you were hired by Vanessa Carter a few weeks ago," Sarah began. "Can you tell me why?" The investigator looked thoughtful for a moment before responding. "Yes, I was hired to gather information about Jake Turner. She was concerned, I guess you could say, about his relationship with Amber. I was supposed to follow him around, figure out where he was spending his time, who he was seeing." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Did Vanessa give you any specific instructions about what to do with the information once you had it?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly weighing his words. "She didn't say anything about that. She just wanted me to find out everything. I did a few checks, got photos, did some surveillance. She paid me to report back, which I did." "Did she seem desperate or anxious about Jake's relationship?" Sarah pressed, leaning in slightly. The investigator nodded slowly. "Yeah, she wasn't just curious. She was frantic, really. She wanted to know everything, down to the smallest detail. She was worried that Jake might cut her off completely if he chose Amber." Sarah's suspicions grew. Vanessa had been obsessive in her need to control Jake's relationships, and now it seemed like she had been preparing for something drastic. The following days felt like a blur to Detective Sarah Davis. With each new revelation, the case grew more complex, and Vanessa Carter's involvement seemed to be more than just a momentary act of passion. The more Sarah investigated, the clearer it became. Vanessa had orchestrated Jake Turner's murder as a final, desperate attempt to reclaim control over her life, and possibly to punish him for choosing someone else over her. But Sarah still had a nagging feeling that something didn't quite add up. Vanessa's obsession with Jake was apparent, but could she have truly killed him alone? There were still unanswered questions, especially about the timeline. Why had she waited until Jake's birthday to commit the crime? Why that day out of all days? To answer those questions, Sarah decided it was time to confront Vanessa again. This time, she had hard evidence: the private investigator's testimony, the financial transactions, and the growing list of clues pointing to Vanessa's motive. Sarah was ready for her to crack, to reveal the truth. Vanessa had been staying with a friend since Jake's death, but Sarah tracked her down to a small, rundown house on the outskirts of town. When Sarah arrived, Vanessa was sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from her lips. Her eyes looked tired, her face gaunt, as if the grief she had shown earlier was starting to fade, replaced by something colder, more calculating. As Sarah approached, Vanessa didn't flinch. She just looked at her with a vacant stare, as if she had been expecting this confrontation all along. "Vanessa," Sarah began, her voice steady, "we need to talk." Vanessa exhaled slowly, letting the smoke swirl around her face. "I've already told you everything I know. I don't know why you keep coming back here, asking me the same questions. I told you I found him dead. What else do you want from me?" Sarah didn't mince words. "I want the truth. I know about the private investigator. I know you hired him to spy on Jake. I know you were tracking his every move. And I know you felt like you were losing him, that he was going to choose Amber over you." Vanessa's face twitched, but she didn't say anything at first. Sarah continued, knowing she was getting close. "You were desperate, weren't you? You were so afraid of losing Jake that you couldn't let go. You couldn't accept that he was moving on with his life." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Sarah pressed on. "Did you kill him, Vanessa? Did you stab him to get back at him? To punish him for choosing someone else over you?" For a moment, Vanessa didn't respond. Then slowly her lips curled into a tight smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been wronged. It was the smile of someone who had gotten away with something. "You don't know anything," Vanessa said quietly. "You have no idea what it's like to be in my position. He used me for years, then just tossed me aside when he got bored. He was supposed to be with me. We had a family, a daughter. He couldn't just throw that away." Sarah took a step forward. "But you killed him. Why wait until his birthday? Why that day?" Vanessa's smile faded, and for the first time, a flicker of something darker crossed her face. "Jake thought he could control everything. He thought he could have it all. Me, Amber, his little perfect life. But he never really understood what it meant to be a family, what it meant to me. He wasn't going to leave me behind. Not after everything we had been through. Not after all the sacrifices I made for him." Sarah's stomach churned as she pieced together what Vanessa was saying. This wasn't just about love or jealousy. This was about power. Jake had rejected her, and Vanessa was unwilling to accept that she was no longer his priority. She had planned the murder carefully, waiting until Jake's birthday to strike, when he would be most vulnerable. Vanessa had spent weeks preparing for that day. She had hired the private investigator to track Jake's every move, to confirm what she had already feared, that Jake was planning to cut ties with her and choose Amber. But instead of talking it out, instead of trying to work things through like she had done so many times before, Vanessa made a choice. She would make sure Jake couldn't hurt her again. "That's when I decided," Vanessa said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Jake had to pay for what he did to me. I loved him, but he destroyed me. He didn't deserve to have everything he wanted. I wasn't going to let him go without a fight." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Vanessa had killed Jake, not out of rage in the moment, but out of cold, calculated vengeance. She had been plotting for weeks, carefully organizing her plan to make Jake's death look like an accident or a random act of violence. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that Vanessa had been planning this for a long time. Detective Sarah Davis sat at her desk, staring at the notes she had taken during her interview with Vanessa Carter. The woman had confessed to the murder of Jake Turner, but Sarah knew the case wasn't closed yet. There were still too many unanswered questions. Vanessa had seemed almost proud of what she had done, convinced that she was justified in taking Jake's life. But there was something about the way she had told her story that made Sarah uneasy. It wasn't just the coldness in Vanessa's voice. It was the fact that Vanessa had seemed to have everything so meticulously planned. It didn't add up. Sarah was determined to get to the bottom of it all. She decided to revisit the crime scene, to see if she had missed anything that could shed new light on the case. She was going to look for any inconsistencies in Vanessa's story that might expose a deeper truth. The crime scene had been Jake Turner's apartment, the place where he had spent the final moments of his life. It was a small modern unit located on the fifth floor of a downtown building. From the outside, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Sarah knew that every corner of a crime scene could hold vital clues. She had been there on the night of Jake's death, but now, with Vanessa's confession in mind, she needed to examine the scene with fresh eyes. When Sarah arrived at the building, she was greeted by the crime scene investigators who had been working the case since the night of the murder. They had already processed the area, but Sarah needed to see it for herself. She wanted to confirm the details that Vanessa had mentioned. Was everything in place, just as Vanessa had described it? Or had there been something more to the murder than just a moment of rage? Inside the apartment, Sarah was struck by how ordinary everything seemed. The living room was tidy, the furniture arranged as though it had been carefully placed, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. The bloodstains were a stark reminder of the violence that had taken place here just days earlier. Sarah stepped carefully around the area, her eyes scanning for any signs of a struggle, any evidence that could point to a second party. The investigators had already taken photographs of the blood spatter, the positioning of the body, and the murder weapon, a kitchen knife that had been left next to Jake's body. There was no sign of forced entry, and the apartment showed no signs of a break-in. It was clear that Jake had known his attacker, that the killer had been someone he trusted. Vanessa had been right when she said she had been in the apartment with him. But what if there had been something more to that night? Sarah focused her attention on the bedroom, where Jake had been found. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled as if they had been disturbed. It was exactly as Vanessa had described, but Sarah noticed something odd. On the bedside table, there was a small note. It wasn't there when the crime scene investigators had processed the area. Sarah picked it up carefully, reading the short message. "I will make you regret it." The note was handwritten, and it was signed only with the initials V. It was brief, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart race. Vanessa had left this note, a chilling reminder of her plans. It wasn't just a murder out of jealousy or frustration. Vanessa had been preparing for this moment, and this note seemed to confirm that. She had intended for Jake to understand why he was being killed, to make him suffer for choosing Amber over her. But what disturbed Sarah even more was the fact that the note had been left in Jake's room, but there was no sign that Vanessa had left it there herself. Had she written it beforehand, or had someone else written it? And if it was written by someone else, who? It was an unsettling thought. The note was written in the same handwriting as the note found in Jake's office earlier, a clue that had never seemed significant until now. Sarah turned to one of the officers on the scene and asked, "Did the initial investigators find this note?" The officer shook his head. "No, it wasn't there when we went through the apartment. It must have been missed." "This is critical," Sarah said. "It's possible this note was planted after the fact. We need to find out who wrote it." Sarah left the apartment feeling unsettled. Vanessa's confession was becoming less and less reliable. Something didn't add up. Vanessa had admitted to the murder, but now there was evidence suggesting that she wasn't working alone. Someone else had been involved, someone who had helped her plan Jake's death. Back at the precinct, Sarah met with her partner, Officer Mark Collins, to discuss the new developments. She showed him the note and recounted her visit to the crime scene. The confession from Vanessa Carter had shaken Detective Sarah Davis to her core. It wasn't just the brutal nature of Jake Turner's murder. It was the realization that the crime had been fueled by complex emotions and manipulation, the result of deep-seated jealousy and vengeance. Vanessa, who had once seemed so cold and calculating, had finally admitted to being the mastermind behind Jake's death. However, the confession also introduced a chilling new twist. Amber, the woman Jake had chosen, was complicit in the crime. Sarah had to act fast. Vanessa's statement was a significant breakthrough, but Amber was still out there, and her role in the murder couldn't be ignored. Vanessa had confessed to helping orchestrate Jake's death, but it was clear that Amber was the one who had pushed her over the edge. The woman who had been Jake's new lover was now the key to unraveling the full extent of the crime. Sarah gathered her team, going over the information they had so far. Vanessa had revealed that Amber had been involved in the planning, but Amber's whereabouts were still unknown. She had gone underground after Jake's death, perhaps knowing that the walls were closing in on her. Sarah wasn't sure if Amber had fled the state or was lying low somewhere, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Amber escape. The first place Sarah visited was Amber's apartment. It was a modest two-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Amber had been renting the place for several months, and neighbors had described her as quiet, withdrawn, almost ghostly in her presence. But Sarah had no doubt that Amber's life had been far from peaceful. The woman had been deeply involved in a twisted love triangle that had ultimately resulted in murder. If Amber was hiding, Sarah was determined to find her. When Sarah arrived at the apartment, she was greeted by a sense of emptiness. The door was ajar, but there were no sounds inside. The building was eerily quiet, and the hallway smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke. Sarah stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the rooms as she walked through the apartment. It looked undisturbed, as if no one had been there for days. The furniture was simple, nothing extravagant, but the air felt oppressive, like something had gone terribly wrong here. In the bedroom, Sarah spotted something that caught her attention. On the bed was a bag, half packed with clothes. There were no signs of a hasty departure, no signs of struggle. But the bag, along with an open suitcase, told Sarah that Amber had been in a hurry to leave. She checked the closet and found it half empty, the few remaining items arranged neatly. Whoever had been living here was gone now, but the question was, where had Amber gone? Sarah began to go through Amber's belongings, looking for any clues that could help locate her. As she rifled through the drawers, she found a stack of old photographs. Some were of Jake, others were of Amber and Vanessa. Photos taken during times when their relationship had seemed more innocent, before it had devolved into a deadly rivalry. There were no photos of Amber and Jake together, but there were plenty of snapshots of the two women sharing intimate moments. Then, tucked under a stack of papers, Sarah found a letter. It was addressed to Amber, written in a handwriting that seemed familiar. It was from Vanessa. Amber, I know what we're doing is dangerous, but I can't stop thinking about Jake. We can't let him slip away from us. Together, we can make him see that we are the only ones who truly care about him. If we have to do something drastic, so be it. Just don't let him get away. He needs to understand how much he hurt us. I'm with you in this. Don't back out now. The letter made Sarah's blood run cold. It confirmed that Amber and Vanessa had been in this together from the beginning. The murder was no spur-of-the-moment act of passion. It was a well-planned conspiracy. They had both plotted Jake's death for months, manipulated their way into his life, and had ultimately decided to end it all in the most violent way possible. But now the letter revealed the deeper motives. Vanessa and Amber were so consumed by jealousy and a desire to keep Jake to themselves that they were willing to destroy everything in their path. Sarah took the letter with her as she left the apartment. She knew now that Amber was just as guilty as Vanessa. It was time to bring her in for questioning. The following day, Sarah and her team set up surveillance on Amber's known contacts. There was no doubt that Amber had gone into hiding, but Sarah was convinced that someone close to her would eventually give her up. It didn't take long before a breakthrough came. One of Amber's old co-workers, a woman named Lisa, had received a call from her. Lisa was hesitant at first, but eventually admitted that Amber had reached out to her the night before, asking to meet at a secluded cabin on the edge of town. The weeks that followed Amber's arrest were quiet, and Sarah Davis couldn't shake the weight of the case. It was the kind of case that stayed with you long after the suspect was behind bars, a case where the true tragedy wasn't just in the loss of life, but in the ripple effects that spread through everyone involved. Jake Turner was dead, and his family was forever altered. But so were Vanessa and Amber. Their lives had spiraled into darkness because of one man, a man they both believed they couldn't live without. Sarah sat at her desk, going through the final reports. The trial was set to begin, and everything had to be in place. Vanessa had already confessed, and Amber was now facing the same fate. But despite their guilt, Sarah still found herself reflecting on what had driven these women to murder. What had happened to their sense of reason? Had they ever truly loved Jake, or had he simply been a symbol of something they couldn't possess on their own? Was their jealousy the only force that had bound them together? The trial of Vanessa Carter and Amber Harris was a media spectacle, and Sarah's every move was scrutinized. The courtrooms were packed with people who wanted to see justice served, and it was clear that this case had caught the public's attention. The media called it a love triangle turned deadly, but for Sarah, it wasn't about the sensationalism. It was about the broken lives left in the wake of a senseless murder. As Vanessa took the stand, her once confident demeanor was gone. She looked tired, broken, and regretful. The woman who had been so cold and calculating was now just a shadow of herself, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. Her testimony was one of remorse, but it didn't bring Jake back. It didn't fix the damage she had caused. When asked why she had done it, she gave the same answer she had given to Sarah. Jake had hurt her, rejected her, and she couldn't bear to see him move on with someone else. Amber, on the other hand, was much more defensive. Throughout the trial, she maintained her innocence, claiming that she had never intended to kill Jake. She said she had been manipulated by Vanessa, that Vanessa had been the one to plan everything, and that she had only gone along with it because she felt trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. But Sarah knew better. The evidence didn't lie. Amber had been just as complicit as Vanessa, and her defense was nothing more than an attempt to save herself from the consequences of her actions. As the trial unfolded, Sarah found herself sitting in the courtroom, watching everything play out in front of her. She had spent countless hours working this case, piecing together the puzzle of Jake's life and death. But now that it was all coming to a close, there was no sense of relief. There was no victory to be found in this tragedy. There was only the overwhelming sense that something had gone terribly wrong, something that could have been prevented if only Jake had seen the danger in front of him earlier. The final day of the trial arrived, and the jury deliberated for hours. Sarah paced in the hallway, her mind racing with thoughts of what had brought these women to this point, of how fragile human emotions could become when tangled with love, jealousy, and betrayal. She knew that whatever the outcome, it wouldn't undo the harm that had been done. There would be no justice that could heal the pain Jake's family felt, or the pain Vanessa and Amber would feel for the rest of their lives. Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. Amber was found guilty of second-degree murder, and Vanessa was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced them both to prison, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to feel satisfied. The justice system had done its job, but the tragedy would never leave anyone untouched. Weeks later, Sarah found herself at a memorial for Jake Turner. His family had decided to hold a small gathering in his memory, a way to honor his life despite the way it had ended. Sarah wasn't sure what compelled her to attend. Perhaps it was the need for closure, or maybe it was because she had seen firsthand how much pain Jake's family had gone through. She stood in the back, watching as friends and loved ones spoke of Jake, the good man he had been, the joy he had brought to their lives, and the promise he had carried with him. The service was simple but heartfelt. There was no grand display of emotion, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet remembrance of a life that had been cut short. Jake had been a son, a brother, a friend, and a lover. He had been caught in a web of affection and anger, and it had cost him everything. As Sarah listened to the eulogies, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something she could have done differently, if there had been any way to prevent this tragedy from unfolding. But the truth was, there was no way to rewrite history. The investigation was over, and the suspects were in prison.